Chapter 2. The Price of Stolen Crowns. The harbour reeked of salt and rotting fish, the morning sun already drawing sweat from Kira's borrowed cloak despite the chill wind cutting across the docks. She pressed herself against a stack of crates, her breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with the sprint through the twisted alleyways of the lower city. The stolen artifact burned against her chest, where she'd hidden it beneath layers of cloth, its presence a constant whisper at the edges of her consciousness. Not quite sound, not quite sensation, but something that made her teeth ache and her vision blur at the corners. They're already looking. Varek won't wait. He can't afford to. She'd seen the council's soldiers spreading through the market district as she fled, their black uniforms stark against the colourful chaos of morning trade. Methodical, efficient, closing off exit routes like a net drawing tight around a single fish. Every instinct screamed at her to drop the fragment into the harbour and run, but her fingers remained locked around the cloth bundle beneath her cloak. Pulling the hood lower over her face, she tucked away the distinctive copper-red hair that marked her as distinctly not local to anyone who bothered to look. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the fabric, and she cursed the weakness. Third pier from the Fishmongers' Guild. She forced the words out like a prayer, repeating the directions Pip had given her. The docks stretched before her like a different world from the ordered silence of the archives. Sailors shouted in a dozen languages, their voices mixing with the creak of wood and rope, the slap of waves against hulls, the raucous cries of gulls wheeling overhead. Cargo nets swung through the air, laden with crates and barrels that smelled of spices, lamp oil, and things less easily identified. A merchant vessel was being loaded 2 piers over, its crew moving with the practiced efficiency of men who knew the tide wouldn't wait for stragglers. She forced herself to move with purpose rather than panic, adopting the rolling gait of a sailor bred to shifting decks. A group of dock workers passed, their arms full of coiled rope, and she fell in behind them as though she belonged. One glanced back, his weathered face creasing with confusion, but she met his eyes with the blank expression of someone too tired to care about strangers, and he shrugged and turned away. The Fishmongers' Guild Hall loomed to her left, its wooden sign depicting a crowned salmon that had seen a better decades. She counted piers. 1, 2, 3. A sleek vessel sat low in the water, built for speed rather than cargo. Its hull had been painted black, though the colour had faded to grey in places where salt and sun had done their work. The figurehead was a serpent, its carved scales picked out in peeling green paint, fangs bared toward the horizon. Unlike the larger merchant vessels, this ship looked ready to sail. Supplies already loaded, crew already moving across the deck with practiced efficiency. "You lost, girl?" Kira spun to find a man blocking her path to the gangplank. He was built like a barrel, with arms thick as anchor chains, and a face that suggested he'd lost more fights than he'd won, but had won enough to still be standing. A cutlass hung at his belt, its grip worn smooth with use. "I'm looking for passage. Pip said Captain Wren might have room for someone who can work and keep quiet. That little rat owes me 3 silver from Dice. You carrying his debt?" Kira weighed her options. Lie or truth? He'd see through a lie, but the truth might get her thrown in the harbour. She chose a middle path, enough honesty to seem genuine, enough omission to stay alive. "I don't have 3 silver. I have 5 gold if the captain can get me out of the city before the council locks down every ship in the harbour. The sailor's expression shifted, interest warring with caution. His gaze flicked past her shoulder, and she didn't need to turn to know what he'd seen. The soldiers were getting closer, their search pattern tightening. 5 gold buys you a hammock in the hold and no questions asked. And if you're carrying anything that'll bring Varek's dogs sniffing after us, the captain will toss you overboard himself. We clear? Kira's hand moved to her chest, feeling the fragment's warmth through the layers of cloth. Every instinct screamed that boarding this ship was a mistake, that she should find another way, that involving strangers in her flight would only get them killed. But the alternative was capture, interrogation, death, or worse. Whatever Varek had planned for someone who'd stolen a piece of the crown, his council had spent 20 years ensuring stayed broken. Crystal clear, the rest when we're past the harbour mouth. The sailor examined the coins, bit one to test its authenticity, then jerked his head toward the gangplank. Name's Torvin. Keep your hood up and your mouth shut until we're underway. Captain's in his cabin. I'll tell him we've got a passenger who paid premium for discretion. Kira climbed the gangplank on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The deck rolled beneath her feet, and she grabbed a rope to steady herself. Behind her, she heard shouting, soldiers calling to each other, their search growing more urgent. The ship creaked and shifted as the tide pulled at its moorings. No going back now. The game's begun, and I don't even know all the pieces on the board. The artifact pressed warm as a living thing beneath her shirt, and in the distance she heard the harbour bells beginning to ring. Somewhere in the city behind her, Theron sat in a council cell, paying the price for her curiosity. Somewhere ahead, fragments of a broken crown waited to be found, or to destroy anyone foolish enough to seek them. The deck tilted beneath Kira's feet as she stumbled aboard, the gangplank groaning behind her. The ship was smaller than she'd hoped, a 2-masted trader whose hull bore the scars of a dozen storms and whose crew looked like they'd survived at least as many. The wood beneath her boots felt slick with brine and something darker, while overhead the sails snapped in the wind like impatient wings. Pressing her back against the mainmast, one hand clutched the fragment through layers of cloth, while the other steadied her against the ship's gentle roll. Her legs threatened to buckle. The sprint through the harbour had left her lungs burning, and the fragment's whisper had grown from a murmur to something approaching a song. Wordless but insistent, pulling at something deep in her chest where the veil coiled like a sleeping serpent. "You're the one Pip sent word about?" The voice came from above, rough as sandpaper and twice as abrasive. A woman descended from the quarterdeck, her salt-greyed hair bound in a braid thick as ship's rope. Scars crisscrossed her forearms, and her eyes held the flat assessment of someone who'd seen every kind of trouble the sea could offer. "He said you needed passage to the Ashen Wastes. Didn't mention you'd be bringing the council down on my head." Kira followed the captain's gaze to the dock. 3 soldiers in black uniforms had appeared at the pier's entrance, their movements precise as they began questioning merchants. One held what looked like a sketched portrait. "I can pay, and you'll have the wind at your back the moment we clear the harbour mouth. I can promise you that." The captain's eyes narrowed, taking in details Kira couldn't hide. The quality of her borrowed cloak despite its stains, the way she held herself like someone more accustomed to quills than rope, the barely suppressed tremor in her hands. The woman spat over the rail, a gesture of disgust or consideration. Wind, is it? You're one of them then. A veiler. Pip didn't mention that particular complication. The word sounded like a curse in the captain's mouth. The soldiers had begun moving down the pier, their formations spreading to cover all exits. Kira's fingers dug into the rough wood of the mast, splinters catching beneath her nails. The fragment warmed where it rested near her heart, and for a moment the veil itself seemed to shimmer into visibility. Threads of silver-blue wind and midnight black shadow twining around her like curious serpents. I could reach them from here, a gust strong enough to knock them into the water, shadow to hide the ship as we cast off. But that many witnesses, that much magic in daylight, they'd know exactly what I am. Dual aspect. Forbidden. Triple the usual rate, and you keep that magic to yourself unless I say different. Last thing I need is council magisters deciding my ship's worth burning. Torvin, cast off. Finn, get those sails ready. We're leaving on the next tide, and that tide's coming early. The crew exploded into motion with the practiced chaos of men who trusted their captain's instincts more than they trusted explanations. Ropes flew, knots unraveled, and the gangplank crashed back onto the dock with a sound like breaking bones. Hold that vessel. By order of the Obsidian Council, hold or be fired upon. Kira's breath caught. The lead soldier had reached the edge of the dock, one hand raised. She saw the shimmer around his fingers, stone aspect, preparing to anchor the ship with pillars of hardened earth. The veil responded to his will, threads of granite-grey power lancing toward the hull. Not after everything. Not when I'm this close. The magic came before the conscious decision, raw instinct overriding years of careful suppression. She reached for the veil with both aspects at once. Wind to shred the stone veiler's threads before they could solidify, shadow to wrap the ship in concealing darkness. The artifact flared hot where it pressed between cloth and skin, and suddenly the magic came easier than breathing, natural as thought itself. The soldier's spell unraveled like rotted silk. His face went white with shock, not at the failure, but at what he'd felt in that moment of contact. The shadow that engulfed the vessel wasn't the creeping darkness of normal shadow veiling. It was something older, deeper, threaded through with fragments of power that predated the sundering itself. Dual aspect. She's dual aspect, and she has... His voice cut off as the darkness swallowed it. Kira collapsed against the mast, copper taste flooding her mouth. Her nose streamed blood, hot and thick, staining the deck beneath her knees. The veil thrashed inside her skull like a living thing, too much power channeled too fast through pathways never meant to carry such a current. Through the shadow veil, she heard Captain Wren cursing in 3 languages. The ship lurched forward, catching wind that shouldn't exist in the sheltered harbour. Behind them, shouts echoed across the water, more soldiers converging, magical alarms keening their warning across the city. What, in the void's name, did Pip send me? Girl, what are you carrying? Kira couldn't answer. Her vision tunneled, the edges going dark in a way that had nothing to do with her shadow veiling. The artifact blazed where it touched her chest, and in that moment of weakness, its whisper became words. Ancient, terrible, undeniable. Remember. The crown remembers. You are not the first to run, but you must be the last to fail. The darkness lifted as suddenly as it had fallen. The vessel cut through open water, the harbour falling away behind them with impossible speed. On the distant docks, a figure in crimson robes had appeared among the black uniformed soldiers, taller than the rest, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. Even at this distance, Kira felt the weight of that gaze. There you are. Run, little scribe. Run to the wastes, gather your fragments, play at being the crown-bearer reborn. We'll be waiting at every turn. And when you finally realize the crown cannot be restored, when you understand that some things should stay broken, I'll be there to collect what you've stolen. The words carried across the water on threads of magic, meant for Kira alone. She wiped blood from her lips with a shaking hand, her legs finally giving out entirely. As consciousness faded, she saw Captain Wren's weathered face swimming above her, her distant voices shouting for water and cloth. The game had begun. The council knew what she carried. Lady Coldwell was already moving, and in the ashen wastes, the second fragment waited, along with whatever forces Varek had stationed to claim it first. She'd wanted to be invisible, to live quietly among her books and scrolls. But the artifact had other plans. It had chosen her the moment her blood touched that seal, and now there was no going back, only forward, into the teeth of every nightmare that had haunted her since the night her parents died. The ship sailed on, carrying its desperate passenger toward a destination that promised only more danger, more impossible choices, more reasons to wish she'd never touched that ancient door. Behind them, the city of Obsidian shrunk to a dark smudge on the horizon. Ahead, the open sea stretched endless and indifferent. And deep in Kira's chest, the stolen relic sang its wordless song of memory and power and blood. The ship's cabins smelled of brine, old leather, and something acrid that Kira couldn't quite place. Perhaps the residue of burned herbs, or the particular musk that clung to those who spent more time on water than land. Narrow shafts of light pierced through gaps in the shuttered porthole, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny sprites in the stale air. The space was cramped, made smaller by the clutter of maps, navigational instruments, and what appeared to be several generations' worth of accumulated possessions that no sailor could quite bring themselves to discard. Captain Wren sat behind a desk that had been bolted to the floor, her fingers steepled beneath her chin as she regarded Kira with eyes the colour of storm-churned seas. She was perhaps 40, though the sun and salt had carved lines into her brown skin that made precise age difficult to determine. Silver threaded through the black hair she'd pulled back in a severe braid, and a scar ran from her left temple to her jaw. The kind of mark that spoke of violence survived rather than merely endured. So, Pip sends you, says you need passage. Doesn't say why a scribe from the shattered tower is running like the void itself is snapping at her heels. Kira remained standing. There was only one chair, and the captain occupied it with the territorial certainty of someone who knew exactly how much space they commanded. She kept her hands loose at her sides, fighting the urge to touch the artifact beneath her clothes. The whispers had grown stronger since she'd boarded, as though the relic recognized the water's proximity, the possibility of movement. Pip said you valued discretion more than questions. Pip says a lot of things, most of them calculated to get what he wants. He's never sent me someone who had council soldiers turning the harbour inside out, though. That's a new development. One that makes me wonder what's valuable enough to warrant High Magister Varek's personal attention. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the ship swaying at anchor and the muffled cacophony of the docks beyond. Kira's training as an archivist had taught her to read people as carefully as manuscripts, to note the details that revealed truth beneath surface presentation. Wren's posture appeared relaxed, but her shoulders carried tension like a drawn bowstring. Her hands, though still, bore fresh scrapes across the knuckles, a woman ready for violence, but not eager for it. She knows, or suspects. How much did Pip tell her? Kira made a decision, the kind that couldn't be unmade. Moving slowly enough to avoid startling the captain, she reached beneath her cloak and drew out the fragment. It caught the dusty light and seemed to multiply it, casting dancing reflections across the cabin walls that moved with patterns too complex to be mere chance. This is why. This is what they want, and if they catch me with it, they won't just kill me. They'll make sure every record of what I found, every hint that this exists, disappears like smoke. Wren's eyes widened, her cultivated indifference cracking. Leaning forward, her scarred hand reached toward the artifact before stopping just short of touching it. Her fingers trembled, barely perceptible, but there. Blood and ashes. Do you have any idea what you're carrying? What this represents? A piece of the crown of Dawn. The reason 20 years of war have torn this realm apart. The thing Varek will murder anyone to possess. Yes, Captain. I'm aware. Kira's laugh carried no humor. The ship lurched slightly as a larger vessel passed in the channel beyond, and she had to brace herself against the desk. The relic warmed in her palm, responding to her distress with something that felt almost like reassurance. It was wrong, she knew. Artifacts shouldn't feel, shouldn't respond with what resembled awareness. Yet she'd felt it since the moment she'd lifted it from Corvin's pedestal, a connection that went deeper than simple possession. It knows me, recognizes something in my blood, my bones, the same way the seal recognized me, the same way I've always known I was different, dangerous, wrong. The Ashen Wastes. That's where you need to go, where the old forge master maintained her workshop before the sundering. If you're planning what I think you're planning, if you're actually mad enough to try reforging the crown, that's where you'd find the next piece. Kira tucked the fragment away, feeling its absence like a missing tooth. Her tongue kept finding the gap. Can you get me there? I can get you anywhere water flows, girl. The question is whether you understand the price. Moving to the porthole, the captain cracked the shutter enough to peer out. Varek's council will put a bounty on your head. Anyone who helps you becomes a target. My crew, my ship, everything I've built could burn because I took you aboard. Turning back, Wren's expression hardened into something carved from stone and resolve. I was there, though, the night the crown shattered. I was just a deckhand on a merchant vessel, but I saw the sky tear open, saw the void pour through like blood from a wound, and I've watched this realm eat itself alive ever since. The captain crossed to Kira, close enough that the scribe could smell the salt dried into her clothes, see the absolute conviction burning in those storm-grey eyes. If there's even a chance you can fix what broke, if you're willing to walk into hell itself to try, then damn me, I'll take you there. The shouting outside grew louder, more organized, boots on wooden planks, moving with military precision. Wren grabbed a speaking trumpet from its hook on the wall. We leave now, this instant. My crew can cast off in under 5 minutes, and once we're in open water, not even Varek's pet Veilists can stop us without starting a war with the Maritime Alliance. What's your answer, scribe? Safety in surrender or survival in motion? Kira felt the fragment warm where it rested near her heart, felt the veil stirring in response to her racing pulse. She thought of Theron, locked in council dungeons for the crime of showing her the truth. Of Corvin, dying alone in darkness to protect this very relic. Of her parents, dead in a void incursion that might never have happened if the crown had remained whole. Cast off, before they decide negotiation isn't worth the trouble. Wren's grin was sharp as broken glass. Raising the trumpet to her lips, her voice boomed across the deck with the force of a commander who'd shouted orders through countless gales. All hands, prepare to make way. We sail with the tide, and the void take anyone who tries to stop us. The city of Obsidian had become a smudge of shadow on the horizon, its towers reduced to dark needles against the afternoon sky. Kira stood at the stern rail, watching her old life shrink into the distance with each roll of the waves. The wind had picked up once they'd cleared the harbour mouth, filling the sails with a steady pressure that drove them south and east toward waters she'd only read about in dusty maritime logs. Pressing one hand to her chest, she felt the fragment's steady warmth through layers of cloth. The whispers had quieted somewhat, as though satisfied now that she was committed to this course, or perhaps simply conserving strength for whatever lay ahead. The deck moved beneath her feet with a rhythm that should have been unsettling, but somehow wasn't. Perhaps because everything solid had already been stripped away. Her position at the archives, her carefully constructed anonymity, the illusion that she could remain separate from the conflicts tearing the realm apart. First time at sea. Kira turned to find the captain approaching, 2 tin cups in hand. Accepting one, she found it filled with something that smelled of herbs and honey. First time doing anything that matters. I spent my whole life trying to be invisible. Turns out the universe had other plans. The sea teaches you that quick enough. You can chart your course, read the stars, follow every rule in the navigator's manual. But the ocean doesn't care about your plans. It'll take you where it will, and your only choice is whether you fight the current or learn to ride it. Kira sipped the drink, finding it bitter and sweet in equal measure. The warmth spread through her chest, easing muscles she hadn't realized were clenched. You said you were there, the night the crown shattered. What was it like? Wren's expression shifted, shadows crossing her weathered features. Staring out at the water, she remained silent for a long moment before answering. Like watching the world end. We were hauling spice from the Sunset Isles, 3 days out from Obsidian. Clear night, stars bright enough to navigate by. Then the sky just tore, like someone had taken a knife to fabric. And through that tear came darkness, not the absence of light, but something worse. Darkness that moved, that hungered. The captain ordered us to make for port, but half the crew were already gone, just unmade, pulled apart by things that shouldn't exist. We lost 23 sailors that night. Good men and women who'd survived storms, and pirates and every natural danger the sea could throw at them. Gone in minutes, because some fool broke the one thing keeping the void at bay. Kira's grip tightened on the rail. She'd read the historical accounts, studied the casualty reports, memorized the dry statistics that reduced catastrophe to numbers on parchment. But hearing it from someone who'd survived, who'd watched friends die, made it real in a way archives never could. "I'm sorry. For your loss. For all of it. Not your fault. Not yet, anyway. But it will be your responsibility if you succeed. If you actually manage to reforge the crown, you'll be holding the key to either salvation or another sundering. That's a weight most people couldn't carry. Question is whether you're strong enough or crazy enough to try." Kira had no answer to that. She'd stolen the fragment on impulse, driven by curiosity and the naive belief that knowledge was always worth pursuing. But standing here on the deck of a ship sailing toward unknown dangers, she couldn't escape the magnitude of what she'd set in motion. Too late for doubts now. The path is set. All I can do is walk it, and hope I'm strong enough to reach the end. The sun began its descent towards the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Ahead, the ashen wastes waited, a desolate landscape where the forgemaster had once worked her craft, where the second fragment supposedly lay hidden among ruins and ash. And behind them, Lady Coldwell and the Council's forces were already moving, plotting their intercept, preparing to claim what Kira had stolen or destroy her in the attempt. Touching the fragment one more time, she felt its steady pulse like a second heartbeat. "I don't know if I'm strong enough, but I know I have to try. Because if I don't, if no one does, then everyone who died in the Sundering died for nothing, and I can't accept that." "Good answer. Now get some rest. We've got 3 days of open water before we reach the wastes, and you'll need your strength for what comes after." The captain turned and strode back toward the quarterdeck, barking orders to the crew with the easy authority of someone born to command. Kira remained at the rail, watching the last light fade from the sky. Stars began to emerge, ancient and indifferent, the same stars that had witnessed the crown's forging and its breaking. The same stars that would watch whatever came next, triumph or tragedy, salvation or doom. The ship sailed on through darkening waters, carrying its precious cargo toward a destination that promised only danger and impossible choices. But for the first time since she'd opened that sealed door in the archives, Kira felt something other than fear. She felt purpose, direction. The sense that however this journey ended, at least she would have tried to make things right. In the darkness below deck, wrapped in cloth and shadow, the fragment sang its ancient song, a melody of memory and power that only Kira could hear. And in that song lay promises both terrible and magnificent, whispers of what had been and what might yet be. The game had truly begun. The pieces were moving, and in the vast tapestry of fate and choice, the outcome hung balanced on a knife's edge, waiting to see which way the scales would tip. Below deck, the air hung thick with the smell of tar, damp wood, and the accumulated odors of a working vessel. Kira had been assigned a hammock in the crew quarters, a narrow space lined with swinging beds and sea chests, lit by a single swaying lantern that cast restless shadows across the low ceiling. Most of the crew were still topside, manning their stations as the ship cut through the darkening waters, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the fragment's persistent whisper. She sat on the edge of her hammock, the stolen relic cradled in her palms. In the dim light, its surface seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal, patterns emerging and dissolving too quickly to track. The whispers had grown clearer since they'd left port, as though distance from the city's noise allowed her to hear what the artifact had been trying to say all along. What are you? Not just a piece of the crown, something more, something aware. The fragment warmed in response, and for a moment, Kira felt something brush against her consciousness. Not quite a voice, not quite a presence, but an echo of intelligence that had witnessed centuries pass like heartbeats. Images flickered through her mind. A forge burning with impossible heat, hands shaping metal that sang with power, a crown placed upon a brow that blazed with light. Then the vision shifted, and she saw the sundering, not from the safety of distance, but from the perspective of the crown itself. She felt the moment of breaking, the agony of unity torn asunder, the scattering of fragments across a realm plunged into chaos. And beneath it all, a purpose, a design. As though the breaking had been necessary, inevitable, part of some pattern too vast for mortal comprehension. Kira quickly wrapped the fragment in cloth and tucked it beneath her shirt as footsteps descended the ladder. A young sailor appeared, barely more than a boy, with sun-bleached hair and skin darkened by constant exposure to wind and spray. "Captain says you should eat something. Cook's made stew. It's not fancy, but it'll keep you standing." He held out a wooden bowl filled with something that smelled of fish and root vegetables. Kira accepted it gratefully, suddenly aware of the hollow ache in her stomach. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. "Thank you. I'm Kira." "Finn. Been sailing with Captain Wren since I was 10. She took me on after my village was destroyed in a void incursion. You're the first passenger we've carried in months. Must be important business to pay what you did." Kira spooned stew into her mouth, buying time to consider her response. The boy seemed friendly enough, but she'd learned the hard way that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Just trying to get somewhere the council can't reach, same as half the people in the realm, I imagine." The ashen wastes, though. That's not just somewhere. That's where the old magic sleeps, where things from before the sundering still linger. Captain says the place is cursed, that the Forgemaster's death left a stain on the land that won't ever wash clean. The fragment pulsed against Kira's chest, as though responding to the mention of the Forgemaster. She felt a surge of emotion that wasn't quite her own. Grief, perhaps, or regret. The sensation passed quickly, leaving her unsettled. Curses can be broken, or so the old stories say. You believe that? That things can be fixed, even after they've been broken for so long? Kira met the boy's eyes, seeing in them a reflection of her own desperate hope. He'd lost his home to the chaos that followed the sundering. How many others had lost just as much? How many more would lose everything if the fragments remained scattered, if the balance between realms continued to deteriorate? I have to believe it, because the alternative is accepting that the world will just keep tearing itself apart until there's nothing left worth saving. Finn smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered young face. Then I hope you find what you're looking for in the wastes, and I hope it's worth the journey. He climbed back up the ladder, leaving Kira alone with her stew and her thoughts. She finished eating mechanically, her mind already racing ahead to what awaited them. 3 days of sailing, Wren had said. 3 days to prepare for whatever trials the ashen wastes would present. 3 days before the real test began. Lying back in the hammock, she felt the ship's gentle rocking, heard the creak of timber and the distant calls of the crew. The fragment rested warm against her heart, its whispers fading to a background murmur as exhaustion finally claimed her. Her last conscious thought was of the vision the artifact had shown her, the crown whole and blazing, worn by someone whose face she couldn't quite see. Was that the past, or a glimpse of what could be? Sleep took her then, pulling her down into dreams filled with fire and shadow, with voices speaking in languages she'd never learned but somehow understood. And through it all, the fragment sang its ancient song, a melody of breaking and remaking, of endings that were also beginnings, of a destiny that had been set in motion long before she'd ever touched that sealed door in the archives.